and welcome to the Secrets of Organ Playing podcast. I'm your host, Vidas Pinkevičius. Today's guest is organist and harpsichordist Gavin Black, who is the director of the Princeton Early Keyboard Center. Gavin is best known for his recordings of 17th-century keyboard music on the PGM label. He studied organ and harpsichord with Paul Jordan and Eugene Roan, and conducting with Jahja Ling and Otto-Werner Mueller, and attended Princeton University and Westminster Choir College. He served as Associate University Organist at Princeton from 1977 to 1979 while a student there, and was organist and senior choir director at Hillsborough Reformed Church, Millstone, New Jersey from 1988 until 1994. He has been a teacher of organ, harpsichord, clavichord, and continuo-playing since 1979, teaching from time to time at Westminster Choir College and at the Westminster Conservatory of Music. He currently writes a monthly column on organ and harpsichord teaching for the Diapason. As a performer, Gavin Black has focused on 17th-century keyboard music, especially music of Dutch, German, or Italian origin, and on the organ music of Bach, which he has performed in its entirety. In the year of 2002, he performed Bach's Art of the Fugue on the new organ at the Princeton Theological Seminary and elsewhere. His recording of harpsichord music of Sweelinck, played on a Philip Tyer copy of a Rücker's transposing double, was released in 2006 by Centaur Records, and his recording of music of Frescobaldi played on a 17th-century Italian harpsichord will also be released by Centaur. Gavin Black has also specialized in the music of the 20th-century American composer Moondog, recording a selection of his harpsichord music for the Musical Heritage Society in 1978. He has made a specialty of Bach's Art of the Fugue and has recently recorded that work in a version for two harpsichords with George Hazelrigg. Gavin Black has also been a founding member of several chamber ensembles, including the Princeton Baroque Ensemble, Whitechapel Baroque, and Channel Crossings. He is currently the continuo player for the ensemble Col Legno. In this conversation, Gavin shares his insights about teaching. So if you are a teacher or a student of harpsichord or organ, I hope you will find this deep conversation inspiring. It's a rather long episode, but we didn't want to split it into two parts, because listening to it all, maybe not in one sitting, will be worth it. Let's go to the show. So, Gavin, I'm so delighted that we're finally having this conversation after all those waiting months that passed between our communication, right?
Exactly.
And,
yes, I am delighted too. Thank you.
You're so generous with your ideas you share on the Diapason column, on pedagogy, on teaching, on practice techniques. Over the summer, I've read, how you record pieces by Frescobaldi on the harpsichord, yes. Right? So we're going to talk about that in greater detail, of course. But so thank you so much for doing this. You're very generous, and welcome to the show.
Well, this is a great pleasure. Thank you.
So, Gavin, let's start with the way it's very interesting for our listeners to hear your background. How did you become interested in the organ? Who introduced you, and how did you fall in love with it?
Sure. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. Good set of questions. I was born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut, the town where Yale University is, and it happened that in the 1960s, when I was growing up, there was a lot of interesting organ activity going on there. I didn't know that initially, but the first thing I remember about music is kind of in a sense from the side as far as organ is concerned, because when I was, as far as I can remember, 6, 7, 8 years old and starting occasionally to listen to music, I was really drawn to Baroque repertoire. I remember my parents had a recording of the Brandenburg Concerti, a recording of Handel's Messiah, or at least parts of it, a recording of the Philadelphia Orchestra playing Corelli and Handel, and all these things I listened to, and as I say, I was just drawn to those sounds, to that kind of music, and in some mysterious way, I began to become aware that I was interested in the harpsichord. Right. And I started taking piano lessons at the age of 8, largely because that's what everyone did who was interested in music, and why not? And there was a good piano teacher who happened to live across the street from us, but she had in her home a large and beautiful-looking harpsichord that her husband had built. That was one of the first kit harpsichords built back in the 1960s. And the thing about that instrument was that they didn't let anybody play it or go near it. And I think it had, for me, the feeling of a kind of distant goal. It was something that was shimmering off on a hill somewhere that was enticing and beautiful, and that I wasn't allowed to go near. So, but then also hearing sounds of the harpsichord on various records, I was aware that there was a wonderful collection of antique musical instruments in town. I don't remember exactly when the first time was that I ever went there. And I was aware that the harpsichordist Ralph Kirkpatrick taught at Yale and was nearby and played, although I never actually heard him till years later. But these were all things that were just sort of intriguing and exciting about music to me. And so then the next chapter in this part of the story is that I happened to go to a summer music camp in the summer of 1968 when I was 11, and one of the counselors at that camp was Paul Jordan, who was the organist at one of the churches in downtown New Haven, United Church on the Green. And someone who, as best I remember, another camper whom I hadn't known previously, just as we were chatting, said something to me about, this Paul Jordan, he's an organist, maybe he would show you that instrument. You might think that was cool. And, just because I was a keyboard player, sort of, and I like Baroque music. So Paul happened to be an aficionado of Baroque-style instruments, tracker instruments, and the organ in his church was one that had been built about 3 or 4 years earlier, one of the earliest German Baroque-style organs to come to the United States. And so the sort of the gist of the story is that in that fall I went to that church. Paul played sounds and music on that organ for me, and I really fell in love with that instrument, which got me interested in the organ and also kind of set the course for the kind of organ that I was most drawn to. And the sound, I can still remember listening to the sounds of the Regal and the Quintadinas and of course, the principals and the mixtures, and just falling in love with those sounds. So that was the beginning of my getting interested in organ.
Fantastic story, Gavin. A lot of people start to be interested in organ when somebody in the choir, right, or an elderly organist introduces, gives organ demonstration up close, right, hands-on experience. Maybe this young person, teenager, maybe touches the instrument, plays with the feet, and gets hooked, right? But in your case, probably it was the recordings that you first fell in love with, right? Especially harpsichord, right?
Yes, I think harpsichord recordings initially, and then this experience with the organ at United Church. And about the same time, I became a boy soprano in the choir of men and boys at Trinity Church in New Haven, right down the block from United Church. And there, the sort of aesthetic focus was very different. It was a then fairly new, probably 50-year-old American organ, an electro-pneumatic organ, what at the time was very traditional, sort of Anglican-style instrument. And so singing in that choir, which I loved doing at the time, also got me interested in the organ, but a very different aesthetic, and kind of rounded out my picture of what the organ was like very early on. And then I like most people of, the last 60, 70, 80 years, I listened to a lot of recordings, and I remember going to the New Haven Public Library probably in around 1969 or something like that, and taking out an LP of E. Power Biggs called Bach at Zwolle, in which he played some of the preludes and fugues, and I can still remember the sonority of the reed stop that he used to play the fugue subject in that really short C minor prelude and fugue, sort of dancing fugue subject. And that specific thing also helped get me hooked on the organ. And a little bit later, I started listening to Helmut Walsch's recordings. And again, one of the things I'm sort of getting at in talking about it this way is that it was really, both with harpsichord and with organ, very largely the sonorities of the instruments. Sort of rather than repertoire. Of course, I liked the music people were playing on it, and I became interested in playing music repertoire very promptly. But just the sound itself and the way it drew me in, I think that's not uncommon with organ, of course. But that's what my early, most vivid memories of both organ and harpsichord are about, is these sonorities and the way they seem kind of alive.
I can relate. I can totally relate to that, because I remember also listening to old LPs. Of course, we lived in Lithuania, and at that time it was a Soviet period. You didn't get the Western released CDs, but you did get some Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian historical organ series. that people would record on 18th century, 19th century, instruments, and my aunt had this stereo, I think, system that had a fantastic loudspeakers, and I think I would come over to my aunt's and listen for hours to those old recordings, and I was beginning to play the organ a little bit, but not too much, and that was very formative to my early education. These LPs. So that the same was with you, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. So, Gavin, you don't hear a lot of LPs nowadays, right? Everybody is recording CDs, DVDs, right? Sometimes MP3s, right? The downloads digitally.
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Although a number of people are turning back to LPs, and there are some aficionados of all the ways of recording and transmitting music re-emerging nowadays, and the technology has allowed to do this, but majority of organists probably would have forgotten what an LP is, right? The long playing record, right? With various speed
I don't
rates.
know. Maybe. I mean, I suppose it's been a long time since LPs were the standard, but as you say, there's sort of a resurgence. I mean, I have a turntable sitting here in the room next to me, and sometimes I use it, although, of course, it turns out to be a lot easier to put on CDs or streaming stuff, and I think I tentatively believe that on the whole I like the sound of LPs better, but it's hard to sort that out, because you always know what you're listening to, so prejudices come into play, and of course I have a lot of nostalgia for LPs and for sitting there pretty literally wearing out some of the Helmut Walsch Bach recordings and other things that I listened to growing up.
When I graduated from University of Nebraska at Lincoln with Dr. Faulkner and Ritchie, they both retired after my and my wife's graduation. Basically, we were the last students, or almost the last. So Dr. Ritchie, I think, or was it Quentin? Maybe Quentin had the old collection of LPs. I think Walsch's recording series of Bach's organ works. So he gave away of that. So sadly, I didn't have a turntable, with me. But I would have loved to do this, to have this and to bring back home. and somebody got lucky and took those recordings, and
Sure.
of course the series is very, very special.
Yes.
On historical instruments, and made a lot of impact in the organ world back in the day.
Yes.
Definitely.
Sure. So,
Gavin, what happened then next? How you started playing, right?
Sure. Well, it's sort of an interesting. Well, not surprisingly, I find it interesting because it's my life. But I think it's an interesting set of stories about that. So, I was taking piano lessons. Mm-hmm. I was deeply interested in the harpsichord and the organ, and to be honest, I wasn't that interested in the piano, and I took my lessons. I didn't practice very much, starting essentially a lifetime of having trouble making myself do anything that I wasn't really interested in, which is a point we might come back to, because I actually think that can be kind of valuable in helping someone sort out what is and isn't most deeply important. But anyways, I didn't really practice the piano. I was one of those piano students who tried to scramble the day before the lesson to get a little bit of something learned so that the lesson wouldn't be too embarrassing. And during all those years, I spent time going to the organ at the United Church on the Green and just sitting there playing. Mm-hmm. The church was very generous. They let me have a key. Paul Jordan was generous with his time, sitting around chatting about the organ and about music and reminiscing about things and so on. But during those several years, sort of when I was from about 12 or 13 to about 16, I was given the advice by several people, much older organists or organ teachers, that you shouldn't study organ officially until you had become a really accomplished pianist. Mm-hmm. And because of that advice, I spent several years not starting organ lessons, not studying organ very systematically, but also not really working on my piano playing because I just wasn't interested enough in it.
Yes.
And eventually it occurred to me that this advice was wrong. That there was a tradition, a mid-20th century tradition, of course, of learning keyboard playing via the piano. And of course, many, many people have done that and had it work successfully as a path to becoming an organist. But there's no specific reason to do that either. It's perfectly fine to study organ by studying organ. Mm-hmm. And eventually I just decided, I think in the summer of the year when I had just turned 15, if I remember correctly, that I was going to start taking organ lessons and that I was going to focus on that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I did. I had always wanted to take lessons with Paul Jordan. Of course, I admired and liked him and his approach. It turned out that he was away on sabbatical for that year. So my first year I took lessons with his replacement at United Church on the Green, an organist named Wendell Peeler. Then Paul came back and I took lessons with him for a year. And then I went off to college at Princeton and started, in a sense, a whole different chapter because I wasn't at this organ at United Church anymore. The organ at Princeton University Chapel is very different. But during those 2 years before I went off to college, I sort of gave myself permission to believe that working on the organ was the thing that I was doing the most and the most seriously. Started practicing a little bit more systematically, and learning some repertoire. And at that point, I was sort of behind the normal curve. I wasn't a very accomplished player yet, and what I thought I knew about sound and, in a sense, interpretation or the rhetoric of performance was way ahead of anything I could do. But at least I was starting to work on it really seriously and to believe that I was sort of allowed to work on it. So that was that phase. And again, I loved the most all the sounds of 17th and 18th century organs, and through listening and through more and more sitting there playing. The organ I keep talking about at United Church was a Hermann Hillebrand organ, and it's an instrument that's been rebuilt a couple of times. I think it sounds rather different now. The room had very dry acoustics. It was a difficult room to make an organ work in, but the instrument was colorful and beautiful, and things blended very well, and I just loved sitting there often late into the night playing and sort of experimenting with sound.
Gavin, you mentioned how somebody recommended you first become very proficient at the piano, right? Before plunging into the organ. I totally relate to your experience that it's not really a requirement, especially if you specialize in early music, right? Because Johann Sebastian Bach didn't live in the era of pianos, right? And
he never played. That's right. Well, sure. I mean, that occurred to me specifically at some point. Bach and Buxtehude and Frescobaldi all never played the piano, and so in a sense, I mean, it would make more sense for someone who was mostly interested in older music to say, well, I'll study the harpsichord first and then the organ. But again, there's no reason from the time that your feet can reach the pedals, there's no particular reason not to be playing organ itself if organ itself is what you're interested in. So during those same years, as I said, I sort of knew that I really liked the harpsichord, and I listened to harpsichord recordings, occasionally went to concerts, and went to the Yale collection of musical instruments, where again, the instruments were just out of reach, like the harpsichord that I mentioned at my piano teacher's house. There were, velvet museum ropes in front of the instruments, and no way that we, members of the general public, could play them. But they were enticing, and occasionally I heard one of them being played by someone else, and they were beautiful. But again, getting back to this sort of emphasis that my own relationship to music has always had with sonority as such, during those years that we're talking about, I never heard a harpsichord that I could possibly have acquired or practiced on that I liked, where the sound was as beautiful to me as the sound that I heard on certain recordings. And when I was in high school, my parents were very willing to consider our getting a harpsichord, and I have lots of memories of seeing, this is also old-fashioned nowadays, but seeing little classified ads in the newspaper saying harpsichord for sale or whatever, and driving somewhere and looking at a harpsichord, but I could never quite convince myself that I would be happy with that sound. And it was a few years later, around 1977, 78, when I was in college, that I first began to hear some modern-built and potentially available harpsichords where the sound kind of met what I had in my head from having listened to certain recordings. So I did end up playing and really working with organ before I started playing and working with harpsichord, because I just didn't have a harpsichord until later. But that was something that was very much on my mind during those years also.
I knew somebody who would practice on the clavichord exclusively. Fantastic practice instruments for 18th and 17th century organists. They probably, most of them, had clavichords at home, right? Because it was very cold in winter to practice on the organ. So what I mean is that you can even practice 19th century music on the clavichord and pretend it is a later technique, although it would be difficult to play with heels on the clavichord, right? But I knew a person who learned, I think, Liszt or Roebke sonata on the clavichord, pedal clavichord.
Sure. I mean, I suspect that that's a really good idea. I mean, the touch is light and sensitive. You have to listen carefully because it's quiet. Also, the sound can be, of course, really beautiful and entrancing, which is always nice. And I think that practicing anything on the clavichord tends to be useful. Again, we may talk a little bit later about some of my thoughts about teaching, of course, which include the idea that I don't think everything is right for everybody, and I think it's quite different what one person needs. So I certainly wouldn't make a statement like everybody should practice on the clavichord, but I think it is, I often practice harpsichord and organ repertoire, which in my case means mostly Baroque organ repertoire, on the clavichord. I suspect that for later music it can be useful too. Now there are some, of course there are differences that are just plain differences, like on the clavichord it's extremely important to play out near the fronts of the keys. And I think that's also extremely important for harpsichord in a slightly different way, and for especially very sensitive mechanical action organs. I think it's less important both for the piano and for electro-pneumatic or other electric action organs, though I think it's often not a bad idea. So a clavichord will usually lead you in the right direction for fingering for harpsichord music, for example, but it might not lead you in the right direction for fingering for later music. So I think if that's something you bear in mind, it can still work.
You have to pretend it is a later instrument, a later style, sort of imagine. Just like playing on the chromatic keyboard, but imagining that it has a short octave right in the bottom. It's
just and just playing F sharps when you want to hear Ds. And
exactly. And G sharps when you want to have E's, right?
Right, which can mean if it's an E minor triad, it can sound very funny. Right? Yes. Sure.
But that helps. That helps.
Yes. I have an anecdote about how I first got interested in clavichord, which I'd like to toss in here because I think it's sort of a cool story. I mentioned that I never got very interested in playing the piano, and that's true, but I have always been really interested in listening to piano. I probably put on more piano recordings than anything else. All the Schubert and Schumann and Brahms and Satie and Liszt and all that, I love listening to that. And beginning probably in the mid-1970s, when I happened to hear some of his recordings, my pianist has always been Mieczysław Horszowski, who was born in 1892 and who died in 1993, and who performed up to about 1991 when he was 99 years old. But in the early 1980s, I happened to hear that he was giving a series of master classes at the University of Buffalo, and I went up there and got a motel room and sat in Buffalo for a week, listening. I mean, of course, I couldn't play in a master class of his because I didn't play the piano, but listening to him interacting with students, and also he gave a couple of concerts there. But the people who ran the special events office at Buffalo were very kind and generous to me. I was about 24 or something at the time, a graduate, or no, not yet a graduate student even, and they were very welcoming to me. And at one point, the woman who was running this program asked me to get in the car with her and drive off to the motel where we would pick up Mr. Horszowski and his wife and bring them to campus. So, I was sort of nervous but very excited, and I got in the car and we went over there, and he got in the car and his wife got in, and we introduced ourselves, and I said I'd always loved his recordings, and of course I was very young, and I was sort of shaking with nervousness at meeting one of the great musicians of all time. And he asked me what I did and so on, and I said that I play the harpsichord and the organ. And he thought for a minute and said, "There's one very beautiful keyboard instrument that you apparently don't play." And I was thinking, I'm about to be criticized for not being a pianist. Yes. And so I sat there shaking and nervous, and I said, "Oh, okay, is there?" and so on. And he said, "The clavichord." And so when that week ended and I went home and, I was sort of just glowing from a week of having interacted with him a little bit and heard him play and all that, of course the first thing I did was to work on getting a clavichord, and that was the beginning of my own relationship with the clavichord. and I acquired a small sort of Renaissance-style clavichord and began spending time playing it. And the two things that happened the first day that I got that instrument were that I kind of reinvented early fingering for myself. I had never at that point yet gotten interested in early fingering as we've learned it from various treatises and from various manuscripts and so on. But sitting there at this clavichord, I began to discover that if I put my thumbs up on a lot of keys and used the thumb the way pianists and organists largely did at that point, my other fingers went way back into the keyboard and I couldn't make those notes sound at all. So kind of in spite of myself, I started using the second, third, and fourth fingers a lot more, which meant that I began to experiment with certain kinds of non-legato, and I was able to make the connection that a lot of early fingering is very much a kind of clavichord technique fingering, though it also achieves things on harpsichord and organ in the right musical context. And then the second thing that happened was that I was sitting there playing the clavichord in my dining room, and after I'd been doing that for, I think, maybe an hour or so, the telephone rang. And that sound, that telephone ringing at that moment, was the most frightening, alarming, loudest sound I've ever heard, because my ears had gotten so attuned to the quiet, very focused sound of the little clavichord in front of me, that anything else, any normal sound from modern life was just, as I say, I jumped pretty much. I did a sitting jump at that point. So that was my introduction to the clavichord.
It's a beautiful story, Gavin. Really puts everything into perspective, right? How you can listen and focus on the instrument itself and what it can teach you, right? If you try to discover the weaknesses and strengths, right, of that particular instrument. For example, I remember playing in 2000 an instrument built in Sweden, in Gothenburg. They have the new Örgryte church. They were inaugurating the builder built after the models and various statistical examples of North German influences, basically. 4-manual instrument, fantastic instrument, but it had a split keyboard, with split semitones, subsemitones. You do have to be aware where the sharps are, where the flats are. Sometimes they are in front, sometimes are behind, and that also requires a very sensitive approach to fingering. And I was not taught that in Lithuania at that time. So what I used sort of modern fingering with lots of thumbs, right? And I was kind of inexperienced enough to choose E major Preludium by Buxtehude, with four accidentals on that particular instrument. Was a total disaster. But it got me thinking, really, what is wrong with my fingering, and then really somehow when I got more experienced with clavichord, yes, the keys are shorter. You do have to play on the forefront fronts of the keys, right? And that everything falls back into place when you do that. Naturally, very naturally. So what you were talking about and sharing just a moment ago, that instrument itself teaches you, it's totally true.
Yes, sure.
So, Gavin, do you remember what was the first piece that you actually learned, early music piece, maybe actually practiced?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of stages of that. I do remember that the first piece that I tried to learn, and sort of did learn by myself during those years when I wasn't yet taking organ lessons, was the very same Prelude and Fugue in C minor that I mentioned before. Of course, I never remember the BWV numbers, but it's the one that begins with a a tenor C in the pedals with a mordent on it, and goes on for the pedal solo.
Right.
It's supposed to be a very early piece, but that piece, first of all, I learned it without a pedal part, because you can reach all the notes on that piece with the hands, which is interesting. That's not, of course, true of a lot of Bach stuff, but and this is a time when I couldn't play pedals yet and still wanted to sit there playing the organ. So that was the first piece I learned, and I had a sort of fascination with it because of this registration that I had, some years earlier, as I mentioned before, heard in this Biggs recording. But that was also the first piece I ever played on any instrument with an awareness that people were listening. What happened was that at a concert, I think it was a chamber music concert at a church in New Haven, about 1970, probably 71, there was an organ in that room, and when this concert was over, I sort of snuck over to the organ and sat there and started playing this piece. I don't suppose anybody was paying attention, but I sort of had an awareness that there were people in the room milling about, talking, and maybe some of them were hearing me play. So that's the sort of absolute beginning. As a piano student earlier, from the age of 8 on, I had completely successfully avoided ever playing with anyone listening. I managed to be sick or busy or out of town for all of my teachers' recitals and so on. I mean, on purpose. I knew that I was too scared to play in public, and I think that's partly because I wasn't that interested in the instrument, didn't practice much, knew that I didn't have any pieces really ready, etc. But I was thinking about the way any one person relates to music through their lives. That's, of course, been a sort of journey for me, because the last many years I've been a pretty happy performer. I don't get excessively nervous, and I love performing in public. So, but that's partly because now I have mostly learned my pieces, and I do like the instrument. So that was the first piece I ever learned at all. I think the first piece that I learned while taking lessons and sort of with some pedal facility and so on was the famous or infamous popular or unpopular Bach Toccata and Fugue in D minor. And that's a piece, that was the first piece that I played in public in a way that was sort of officially announced. I was a sort of guest organist at a church service at United Church on the Green in the spring of 1974, I think, and that was the first I ever played in public, semi-public. It wasn't announced as a public concert, but it was a church service, and my name was on the program and all that. So I played that piece. I can tell you, I will confess, even though there's no recorded evidence of this, that I played it basically horribly. I mean, I was very nervous. I fell apart a number of times. I may have done things to make it interesting. I cared very much about doing that as much as I could, but it wasn't a very coherent performance. But that's the first thing that I sort of officially performed in public.
And this C minor Prelude and Fugue, it is BWV number 549 apparently, with the pedal solo, right? So it's a rather complex piece if you try to play it with the pedals on the organ, right? But you said you practice on the harpsichord, right? Or
I was probably practicing it somewhat, and this is again a long time ago before I really started studying, but I probably played it on the piano at home and on the organ at the United Church when I went over there. I didn't have a harpsichord yet, but I played it all in the manuals because this was before I had begun to figure out how to play the pedals. And certainly at that time in my life, I doubted that I ever could learn to play the pedals. I think I had a feeling, and again, I should say that I'm talking about a very long time ago, 45 years ago. I was still quite young and hadn't looked into any of this stuff very much, but I had the feeling that I've later seen in other people who come to me for lessons as beginners sometimes, that pedal playing is a kind of magic, and that it's not just something that ordinary people can learn, that it looks so complicated and so difficult and so different from anything else we do with our feet. I think way back in those days, I feared that I would never be able to become someone who could play the pedals. But in any case, I hadn't yet tried that. So with that piece, I grabbed all the pedal entries with my left hand, and I may have had to leave out some notes and some of the big chords. One thing that happens in that piece is that during some of the pedal entries, the hands are just doing big chords, with more notes than there are voices, supposedly. So it's not as rigorously constructed as some pieces.
And Gavin, do you believe actually that pedal playing is really some kind of extraordinary activities that organists must have special skills, other than normal people could not attempt?
No, I really don't. I mean, as I say, I think I feared that was the case when I was 13, 14 years old and wanted to be an organist. And I've had people come to me. I mean, I think that's a common reaction, either on the part of people who just listen and watch an organist, or on the part of some people who want to learn organ, including pianists or harpsichordists who are already very solid, very accomplished keyboard players. It looks, at first glance, it looks like something out of the ordinary. What I really believe about it, after teaching pedal playing among other things for 30-something years now, is that pedal playing is a skill that essentially everybody could learn if everybody wanted to, just like driving or typing or something like that. It's a physical skill that is complex but also very natural. Mm-hmm. So it's not easy. It's not something that anybody can sort of do without thinking about it, or that anybody can learn without putting in effort and work, and without doing it in a way that's sensible as far as the learning process goes. But I think it's a very natural skill. Mm-hmm. I think in one of my columns about pedal playing, which is one of the first things I wrote about in the Diapason column, so this would be about 8 or 9 years ago, I think I wrote that my hypothesis is that learning to play pedals on the organ is, as I just mentioned, a similar level of skill to learning to drive a car well, mm-hmm. and that if playing pedals had the same, I don't remember how I put it, but if it had the same level of importance in our society, if as people grew up, learning to play the pedals on the organ was as kind of liberating and as much a part of the growing up process as learning to drive is, then everybody would learn to play the pedals, and there wouldn't be, nobody would fail to be able to do that.
You're right, Gavin. Although it seems quite magical, right, when an organist plays with their hands and feet.
Oh, sure, it looks that way.
But really, it's nothing special. It's just a third hand, basically. Your feet is a third hand.
Sure.
Samuel Scheidt, I think, wrote in his Tabulatura Nova that pedals should be approached as the third hand, basically. Of course, pedal playing was not developed at this time in his style that much as later, but the approach was still very valid, mm-hmm. right? Third hand, mm-hmm. nothing more.
Sure.
So when you look at this, then anybody can do this, right? Just add one more hand. Mm.
Sure. I mean, I think it's partly, of course, learning it as a skill. Again, I don't want to make it sound like I think it's really easy. Nothing about learning to play a complex instrument is easy, but I like to make a distinction between something's being difficult, hard, or challenging, which I think pedal playing is, and on the other hand, something being unnatural or outside the normal human experience, which I think pedal playing is not. Again, mm-hmm. I think it can be learned, it could be learned by anyone. And of course, there are two dimensions to the process of learning pedals, especially if you're coming at it from already being a keyboard player. One is just learning to navigate the pedal board itself really comfortably, and the other is getting comfortable putting it together with the hands. And of course, not surprisingly, since I do teach this stuff, I have ideas about some of the most efficient and painless but still effective ways to approach both of those things.
So, Gavin, when did you first started teaching?
Well, that is also what I think is kind of an interesting story. I grew up around teachers, not specifically music teachers. Some of them were, but what I'm getting at is that I grew up in New Haven around Yale University. Both my parents have had long careers as professors, and of course a lot of their friends were teachers, and as best I remember, I always sort of thought that I was interested in some kind of teaching. And as I shifted my interest more and more into music, of course I thought initially when I was young, just sort of in a vague general way, that I'd like to be someone who could teach maybe organ and harpsichord, maybe other things about music. But then, just by coincidence, the year after I graduated from college, at a time when I was not yet a very thoroughly trained musician, in college I majored in history. I played the organ a lot, but hadn't quite made up my mind that I could try to pursue a profession in it. Hadn't taken very many music courses. So I graduated from college and decided to spend the next couple of years practicing a lot, trying to find opportunities to perform, get used to being a performer, and kind of see what happened. So again, just by coincidence, that very year, first year out of college, 3 different people that I knew came to me asking for lessons, even though I'd never done any teaching. And it was the same story with all 3 of them. They were young adults who thought that they were not good enough to go to a real teacher. They thought that if they went to an established teacher, that person would turn them away because they were beginners, but they weren't children. And one of the sort of expectations in our society, to some extent, maybe more back then than now, I'm not sure, is that if you're going to be a musician, you have to learn it very young. And so each of these 3 people, they didn't know each other, again, just a coincidence, each of these 3 people came to me and said, I know you're a keyboard player. I want to learn. Can you give me some lessons? I'm scared to go to a real teacher. So I just sort of started dipping my toes into the waters of teaching because I didn't think that it was irresponsible of me to pretend to be a teacher. They knew that I didn't have any experience, and they just weren't going to go to anyone else, so I couldn't do them any harm compared to not taking lessons. So I began. Now, it's also a slightly funny note on the side of the story that 2 out of those 3 people really wanted to play the piano. So the first lessons I ever gave, even though I don't play the piano myself, were piano lessons, sort of. But they also were mostly interested in Bach and other Baroque music. The third person wanted harpsichord lessons. So during those couple of years, I taught those 3 students sort of off and on and tried to teach myself about teaching. Then later I went to graduate school in organ performance and didn't do anything like real teaching during those years. But as I was finishing that program at Westminster Choir College, I went into the office of the Westminster Conservatory of Music, which was and still is a branch of Westminster Choir College that offers lessons to the general public, a community music school. And I just asked them whether they happened to need a harpsichord teacher. I knew that they didn't have one at the time. And what they told me was that they didn't have any demand for harpsichord lessons then, but they would put me on the roster, and if anyone came in asking for harpsichord lessons, they would refer them to me. So that happened. In fact, someone did come looking for harpsichord lessons really just a few weeks after, I think, that conversation. So that's how I started getting more deeply into it, and eventually, pretty soon, they started asking me to teach some organ there as well, and sort of all from there. That was in 1985. So the sort of continuous teaching thing that I've been doing has been going on for a little over 30 years.
Right. So, Gavin, do you think of yourself first as a performer or as a teacher, or is a combination maybe of both?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that it certainly is a combination, because I do a lot of both and I care a lot about both. The other thing is that the answer to that question probably sort of shifts or fluctuates. There have been periods during which I have kind of, just as a matter of self-identity or how I feel sort of when I wake up in the morning and remember who I am, I feel mostly like a teacher. There are times when I feel mostly like a performer and interpreter of Baroque keyboard repertoire, which is what I am as a performer myself. And more I think I've realized that those two things feed into each other. Most of what I know about teaching comes from,
from your own experiences, right, as a performer, probably.
Sure. Yes. Well, sure. I mean, I don't want to shortchange my own teachers, because a lot of what I know about teaching comes from observing the way that my teachers taught me. And I had my two main organ teachers in the end were Paul Jordan, whom I've mentioned a number of times, and Eugene Roan, who was on the faculty at Westminster for about 50 years, beginning in the mid-1950s, and from whom I took organ lessons over a period of about 6 years, sort of spread out in a couple of different times. And they were both amazing teachers, and I learned a lot from them. But on the other hand, I've always been, again, since from very early on in life, I was interested in the phenomenon of teaching. Whenever I was taking lessons myself, I was also trying to sort of analyze myself what was happening and what was working, which most of it, I mean, I think from those two teachers, what they did was very effective and worked very well and was very flexible, which I think is important. Occasionally what didn't work as well. And then when I quit being someone who was taking lessons, I sort of necessity took over the process of my own further education and learning and development as a performer. And I've been, as I've kind of hinted at a couple of times already, I was a late bloomer as a performer. When I graduated from college at the age of 22 in 1979, I had never given a public concert of any kind. I'd done a little bit of church playing. I then ended up spending 4 years mostly practicing and doing the little bit of teaching that I mentioned and doing various other things with my life, but gradually getting into performance, arranging some recitals for myself, basically just by knocking on the doors of churches and asking if I could sit there and play a recital. Then went to graduate school pretty late, and during those years became much more comfortable with performance. But still, what I'm getting at is that I can remember everything about my own act of becoming a musician. It didn't happen when I was little and had barely started to form conscious memories. It didn't happen in junior high school and high school, where maybe I could remember it, but I still wouldn't have known enough to kind of know what was going on. I feel as though I myself, of course, there are always different thresholds and different things that happen in life, but I crossed the threshold from being a kind of tentative, not very comfortable performer to being a comfortable performer and to having some, in my own opinion, some right to ask people to listen to me play. Probably in my mid-30s, I would say. Of course, it's a gradual process, but there was a time when I I undertook to play the complete organ music of Bach in recital, which was a big challenge. Many of the pieces I hadn't really learned when I kind of decided to do that project. So I worked very hard at that. Then I happened, essentially at random, to have a set of recording opportunities drop into my lap, and I prepared very hard for those. And I think both those things moved me very rapidly towards feeling more comfortable about performing. But again, from the point of view of thinking about the business of teaching, what I'm getting at is that I can remember all of that. Some of it I sort of did myself, some of it I did with teachers of my own, but it all happened while I was very much of an adult, thinking about things and remembering things. So everything I have ever done to try to learn to be a player, to be a progressively better player in different aspects of that, to be a more comfortable, happy concert giver, and so on. From all of that, I think I've learned things that I can bring to bear with students. So the two things are woven together, and certainly everything I do in lessons has the potential to spin off something that I can think about as far as my own playing is concerned, which includes sometimes just learning directly from students about a slightly different way of thinking about a certain kind of music, and that, but also watching things that I ask students to do either work or not quite work, and then remembering how I might have done or not done something similar to that and how it worked. It all kind of comes together. So the business of teaching, performing, teaching myself how to be a better teacher, trying to teach other people how to be teachers, which is the official kind of purpose of the column, all those things increasingly just seem to me to be completely interconnected and sort of parts of the same picture.
Yes, Gavin, you touched on some very fantastic aspects here, and when I think about you as a performer and as a teacher, it's just two sides of the same coin, right? Basically,
yeah, I think so.
Because in ideal situation, a person is a better performer when he or she is a good teacher, right? When he can think about those ideas, how can he or she help others, basically, share with others, and that comes back to himself or herself, to that person, because your own performance or practice techniques become more efficient because of that. You can share your ideas, and it comes back. The feedback loop between you and your students, of course, is invaluable.
Yes. No, exactly. That's the idea, and it does work that way a lot of the time.
So great, and of course you are a teacher of teachers, basically, with your column at the Diapason, right? Intending to share your ideas with global audience now. So, what my question is: do you know, Gavin, of many other teachers who do this sort of sharing of ideas, sharing online or in a newspaper or magazine for others, just like you? I don't really. You are one of the very few who are brave enough and generous enough to do this, because
thank you. I mean, I don't. The answer to that is that I certainly wouldn't say that there aren't other people doing similar things, but I don't actually know about them. There's some stuff that you put out there, of course, but I don't know whether there's another regularly published column, either in print or online, about this kind of stuff. And the thing is, so let me digress a bit sort of into the history of the column, if that's okay. Again, not having grown up sort of thinking about teaching in a very general sense, which also means just sharing ideas, even with people who are not your student officially. In, I think, 1995, I got into conversation with a harpsichord builder named Matt Redsell, who ran a magazine called Continuo magazine. I don't know, you may have heard of that, but back in the 90s, I think it was published every month or every other month. It was a pretty well-known and quite good magazine about harpsichord and about early music, Baroque music, occasionally about organ and other related things. It had record reviews and so on. And he and I got into conversation, and the upshot of this conversation was that he invited me to start writing a column for Continuo magazine about harpsichord pedagogy. And in fact, as we spent a couple months figuring out some of the details of that column and how often it would appear and so on, all of a sudden he decided to end the magazine. He left the harpsichord building field, went on to do other things, and the magazine folded. So of course I was disappointed and so on, but before that happened, he said something to me that was really valuable at the end of, I think, our first really long conversation about this column that never happened. He said to me, your ideas are unusual. You have your own way of thinking about things. Make sure that your column reflects that. Don't water it down. Don't try to make it sound like what you think other people would say. Say what you really think. So, and I found that really valuable, and that's a piece of advice that I like to accept about life in general, and I would encourage everybody in the whole world to do that. But in particular, one of the reasons that I was quite sad and disappointed when Continuo magazine folded and that column couldn't come about was that I thought that was intriguing. Could I do that? Could I really find a way to put into words what I thought about aspects of pedagogy that might or might not be the same as what many other people were saying and so on? So then about 10 years later, having not found any other form for doing this yet, not really thought about it, I wrote to Jerome Butera at the Diapason, basically telling him that story and saying that I wondered whether the Diapason would be interested in something like that, focused more on organ, but of course harpsichord comes up once in a while, but and he was interested in the idea, so we sort of picked it up again. Then I think the first column was September of 2007, so it's been 9 years now. But my thought is that if I say what I really think about things and share my own experiences and some of the sort of anecdotes that I've been telling you about how I got into this or that or developed this or that idea, if I do that sort of honestly and accurately, then there's a chance that the column contributes something new and occasionally valuable for some people. If I don't do that, then it's impossible for the column to be particularly valuable, which is also what I think about performance. I mean, I really encourage my own students and other people and myself and so on to play the pieces the way you feel them, and if everybody does that, then the entire picture of what's going on in performance is going to be diverse and interesting and full of new ideas. And, you know, I do think that we all have a tendency to kind of look over our shoulders and say, this great performer who's maybe more famous than I am right now plays these pieces in the following way, so maybe I'd better do that too, unless I can think of a really good reason not to. And I really think for me personally, it's important to come out from under the shadow of that kind of thinking and just, in a sense, try to believe that we're just all in this together, each trying to contribute something. So But anyway, certainly as far as my ideas about teaching, my experiences, what I think has sort of worked well or not worked well, some technical specifics. I mean, the specific way that I myself teach and sort of recommend teaching pedal playing is kind of different from what many or most other people do.
Mm-hmm.
It's different enough that although I think many people who've read my columns about pedal playing have been intrigued by them, or people who've tried the approach have found that it works very well, I've also had some feedback from people who are actually in a couple of cases kind of angry at me for approaching that in the way that I do, and that's okay. I mean, I think it's quite right for people to have a pretty wide variety of different ways of looking at things, and that's interesting. But as I say, I think the very technically speaking, the pedal learning is very different from what most of the printed organ methods talk about and what many people do, but also just things about ways of hearing music or thinking about registration or approaching ornaments or sort of philosophical things like I've been alluding to just now. Where does one get interpretive ideas from? It's always been pretty important to me not to tell a student how to play a passage. I've actually never said to a student, the phrasing for this theme is as follows. So then, of course, that raises the question of how to contribute to the student's ability to think about those things without being that specific or kind of trying to be authoritative about it like that. And that's a whole philosophy that I think is reflected in the column. And I've tried very hard to present what I really think about things, because if I don't do that, then I haven't really contributed anything at all.
So, Gavin, if we are raising artists, right, and we hopefully are, right? You are definitely right in saying that we don't have the right, even attempt to say very strictly this has to sound like this, right, or play it this phrase like that, because everybody is different, and they should find their way probably rather than take your way, right?
Well, that's what I think. Yes.
Although there are some students who would rather copy a teacher, right, and follow instructions than to try to find their own path, don't you?
Yes, sure. I mean, I think that there certainly are, and in part that's because there's a lot of reinforcement for the idea that that's the right way to approach things. I think that the tradition of having printed editions with someone else's interpretive ideas in them, the phenomenon of listening to recordings. I love recordings. We talked about that already. I grew up listening to recordings, but it does, even if no one is saying you must play this the way that your favorite recording artist played it, just the phenomenon of listening to someone else, especially someone who's really accomplished and talented and has a strong point of view interpretively, of course that's convincing, and it kind of seeps into the subconscious. And in general, there's not just about music or the arts, there's a strong tradition of people who are more experienced or just plain older in some cases telling other people what they think is right or how to do something. And I think many or most students come in expecting that, not even necessarily having decided that that's what they want in a kind of purposeful way, but assuming that the role of the teacher is to say, this is the fingering for that passage, and this is the phrasing for that motif, and this would be a good registration for this section of the piece. And there are some students who are very attached to that. And there's a model of learning, which is that somebody who's already learned a lot of this stuff and who already knows it tells you how to do it for a while, and then you begin to recognize patterns and ideas and learn how to apply those patterns and ideas yourself, and then later learn how to evaluate them and maybe change them. And that is a model of teaching. But whether I'm in some sense right about this or whether it's just something about my own temperament, I have no idea. But I've never been interested in that model of teaching. I would rather start from the very first minute saying, okay, this piece that you're working on, what do you think about it? And even if the thing the student says is not very well informed yet, or is not very even not very coherent yet, that's a way to begin a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that most people end up finding that more fruitful. Now, it can mean if you have a student who comes for lessons, and of course in this respect it doesn't matter in the least whether it's harpsichord or organ in the case of someone coming to me, or other things in the case of anyone going to any teacher. If you have a student who comes to you for lessons and you start working on pieces, and as a teacher you don't sort of coach those pieces, you don't say, why don't you play it like this? You just talk about things and you say, why don't you practice it very carefully so that you have the physical ability to do whatever your ears tell you, and then why don't you listen to all the voices very carefully and see what you think about them. You begin a process of the students really listening and thinking well, but it might be that that piece, that month or year, isn't going to sound as good to a listener as it might if you just told the student what to do. But
right.
It forms a better stage in the learning process. At least that seems to be my experience.
It takes longer, right, for information to sink in, but generally people will be more self-reliant, more independent, more free if you don't tell them what to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the idea that from the beginning, if someone from the beginning is learning, not so much learning something about how to play such and such a piece, but actually learning how to think about how to play such and such a piece directly from the beginning, I think that's more interesting and more effective in the long run. Although, I want to admit to my own biases, I find that more interesting as a way to work with students. So it's possible that I'm just letting myself do that in part because I find it more interesting. But I think that the number of students who are really adamant about wanting the teacher to tell them exactly how to play a piece for the time being as a kind of beginning stage is small if you kind of open the question up and talk to people about the process of thinking about things and being patient with that process.
Absolutely.
So anyways, I think that philosophy is definitely reflected in the column. I hope it is. I hope that comes across.
Yes. Do you teach at Princeton too, or you just lead this organization?
Right. No, I don't teach at Princeton University. Over the years, I've done some teaching at Westminster Conservatory and Westminster Choir College, but for the last several years, I've just taught through the Princeton Early Keyboard Center.
So your philosophy as a teacher is reflected in what you do at Princeton Early Keyboard Center as well,
Sure.
I would assume, probably, right?
Of course. Yes, sure.
So, Gavin, when you go back to your career as a teacher, right? You remember your first three harpsichord students, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What would be number one thing you wish you knew about teaching back then that might have helped you?
Oh boy, that's a very good question, and one I haven't really thought about in so many words. I have to see what I can think about that now.
Of course, your teaching style has developed over the tens of years, decades, right? But
sure.
Gavin right now is different, Gavin, from 30 years ago,
sure.
right?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing is that if the kind of teaching that I do, which is sort of from my vantage point, from the point of view of what I'm actually doing, has a large element of being improvisatory. In other words, I feel as though every student who comes in has a different set of expectations and needs and backgrounds and where they're at technically, of course, and musically. And I want to have no preconceptions about exactly what's going to happen with any given student in general prior to that student's coming to me for the first time, but also week by week, month by month. And I think that there are certain things about just having the skill and experience to do that and have it be the most effective rather than relying on a kind of template for what we should do this week, this month, next semester, that I'm just progressively better and better at. I think there's a possibility, I've always had that approach. I think in the early days of my teaching, I think there were occasional students with whom for some number of weeks or an occasional week or maybe longer once in a while, not having a preset program for what I thought a student should be working on, meant that I didn't offer them very much at all, except making the whole experience kind of friendly, because I didn't quite know how to look at what they were doing and really understand what they needed, which I think I can do now. I think after all these years, if anyone comes into my harpsichord studio or to the organ and sits down and starts playing and tells me about their background, I think I just have the knowledge, sort of technical teaching and practicing knowledge, to have a really efficient set of ideas about what they can do next to get them to where they want to go. And therefore I don't need a pre-existing plan for what that should be for a student. And again, 30 years ago, 25, 28 years ago, I took that approach, but I don't think I knew enough to make it work all the time. I think it worked pretty well most of the time. But there are probably a few students out there who came to me early on who basically feel that it was fun and interesting and they liked working with me, but they're not quite sure that I gave them the most intense help with the practical side of becoming a better player, more competent player. I'm just guessing at that. I don't know that. I haven't gotten that feedback from anybody. And I'm trying to be very honest about this. I also think that as a specialist in Baroque music myself, really steeped in that music, probably early on I didn't know enough about later music to be as helpful with students who wanted to work on Franck or Widor or Reger or whatever with me. And partly recognizing that very early in my teaching career, I made a point of trying to learn more about that music and those instruments, and also trying to kind of hone my skills at finding things out if I needed to. If a student brought me music that I wasn't really familiar with, having an approach to making myself really familiar with it so that I could kind of add that into my knowledge about how to teach kind of technical things and be as helpful as possible to that student. I probably just didn't know enough in the early years to be as useful to students who wanted to study repertoire other than my own performance repertoire. So, as I say, that I haven't thought about that question. I'm not certain that either of those things I just described is 100% true, but they strike me as things I would at least want to think about what my teaching was like a long time ago.
Exactly. and of course, your what would be some of the things that might have helped you as a performer when you just first started, right? You are so developed and advanced right now, and have you thought about that a little bit? Did you what would have helped you when you were little and started playing the keyboard instruments back then?
Well, I think in my own case, and it's kind of a special case, and maybe isn't something that's happened to too many people, but that whole story I told before about the piano and my relationship with the piano and the sort of hesitation to jump into playing organ, I think if, let's say when I was about 12 or 13, and really, really loved music and loved the organ and the harpsichord, if I had taken organ lessons, had the opportunity to practice on a good organ under the guidance of a teacher, and had a harpsichord to play, I think that a lot of things would have unfolded more promptly for me as a performer. I don't know that would mean that right now I would be in a very different place. I'm not sure, but I did spend all those years sort of frustrated by trying to play the piano, sort of, when I didn't really want to play the piano. So I think now, as I mentioned before, the more experienced older performers and teachers who advised me to become accomplished at piano playing before studying the organ were very well intentioned and were very good musicians and teachers themselves, but I think in fact it was the wrong thing for me at the time and kind of slowed me down. So
fantastic ideas today, Gavin. I'm so happy that we had this conversation, and people
it's a great pleasure. Thank
all
you.
over the world, I think, will get inspired to look more deeply at what instrument can teach them. Right? Instead of looking for answers from other places, just listen and get a physical feel from your instrument and try to produce the best sound that instrument can do, and a lot of fingering and articulation ideas will become probably apparent, right?
Yes.
And of course, teaching. And of course, teaching is tremendously important for today's profession, of course. And the person who can teach well probably will play well as well. And it's vice versa, probably. Don't you agree?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think if you teach well along the lines that I'm talking about, in other words, kind of open-minded and open-ended, and then you remember to apply that to yourself also. Or if you're a really experienced, thoughtful, good performer, and remember to apply what you do to make yourself a really thoughtful performer to your interactions with your students, that can be very, very fruitful in both directions.
That's right. So, Gavin, of course, our listeners would like to know how they can find you and your work and your column online. Sure. Can you give them a link?
Okay. Sure. A couple things. First of all, I have a website that is gavinblack-baroque.com. There's also the Princeton Early Keyboard Center website, which is pekc.org. And another thing that's kind of convenient is that my name is not a very common name. So if you search my name, Gavin Black, and the word harpsichord or the word organ, I think you'll find a number of ways to track me down. I think I'm sort of easy to find that way. Now, I should say that as far as the column online is concerned, that's through the Diapason, and you can go to their website. I don't know the specifics of getting access to that, what the subscription situation is, and so on. But the Diapason magazine is not that hard to track down either. So.
Yes, so it's of course the Diapason .com, probably, right?
Probably. I'm not sure. I have it.
I've just checked.
I have it on speed dial, more or less. Did you do it? Does it work?
It's the Diapason.com. Yeah, www.thediapason.com. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gavin.
Thank you very much.
Keep on teaching
and pleasure.
Inspiring other teachers and inspiring other performers to share their art. It's so tremendously important in this day and age.
Thank you very much. I will do my best.
If you liked this conversation, I encourage you to visit my blog Secrets of Organ Playing at organduo.lt, where you will find lots of insights, practical advice, and training for every area of organ playing. You can subscribe to this blog for free to get your daily dose of inspiration and to be the first to know when any of my future podcasts roll out. I hope to help you reach your dreams in organ playing. I'm Vidas Pinkevičius. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you online really soon.